Good evening, everyone. Wahoo wah. My name is Margot Lee Shetterly. I'm the author of the book Hidden Figures, and it is a real pleasure for me to be here with all of you tonight. My book Hidden Figures came out in September, a year ago. The movie based on it debuted in December 2016. And for more than a year, I have been on the road and I have traveled to every region of our country. I've spoken to groups of every conceivable age, gender, race, ethnicity, class, professional background, and yes, even political persuasion. And regardless of the nature of the group, there are certain questions that people always have about this story and how it came to be. So I know we're going to have a Q&A, but what I wanted to do to kick things off is to address the question that without fail I have received more than any other, and that is, why didn't I know about this story before? So whenever I'm asked that question, it is accompanied by a range of emotions. Sometimes it's asked with elation, such as when I meet a young girl or a woman passionate about math and science, and she feels that she's finally found her people. Sometimes it's asked with a tinge of shame and the weight of the past that accompanies nearly every discussion that we have about our country's racial history. And I also hear it asked with anger, particularly from older people of color or from women who are fighting their way up in the science fields at the same time as these women without knowing that they were part of an invisible sisterhood. And I understand where the anger comes from. It's the anger of feeling deprived of knowing something that's so inspiring that it has life-changing potential. I've heard the question so many times at this point that I know that you guys are asking this and you're saying, I cannot believe that I never heard this story, but I want to tell you, since this book came out last year, I've spent a lot of time in Hampton, Virginia, which is my hometown. That's where the NASA Langley Research Center is located, and that's where this story takes place. And all the time on the streets of Hampton, Virginia, I run into people who live down the street from Dorothy Vaughan, or they went to church with Katherine Johnson. And though those people knew the women, they too are asking me, why didn't I know this story? Meaning, why didn't I know about the contributions that my neighbors and my friends were making to science, to our community, and to our country? And the fact is, this is a pretty big story to have been hiding in plain sight for so many years. The first 5 black women started working at the Langley Laboratory, as it was known then, in 1943. And I believe that when we count all 10 of the NASA centers from 1943 through 1980, there may have been as many as 80 black women working as computers, mathematicians, engineers, and scientists. And what's just as amazing and remarkable is that that group of black women were part of a cohort of female mathematicians from all backgrounds that starting in 1935 grew to be several hundred and perhaps more than 1,000 strong. And these women were part of an even larger group of women working as mathematicians at other organizations, like the female astronomers who did the fundamental work of classifying stars, working at the Harvard Astronomical Laboratory in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And if you haven't read David Sobel's book on the subject, it's called The Glass Universe, you definitely should check it out. Or the women of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that Natalia Holt writes about in her book, The Rise of the Rocket Girls. I recently read a book called The Idea Factory, and that book talks about the early days at Bell Labs, which became AT&T. And there's one little line in the book, it's not even a half sentence, that mentions the women working in the math department. When I saw that little sliver of text, a light bulb went off, because hiding in that text was a room full of women, just like the ones that I wrote about in Hidden Figures. So why then has it taken us so long to tell their stories? Why didn't we turn Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, Christine Darden, and the other women like them into professional role models and use them to pull generations of young people, particularly young women, into science careers? That question has many answers. One of the obvious reasons is that the black women were literally hidden away in a separate office from the white women. And the fact that computing was considered a female job, the women, regardless of their race, were given a lower classification. They were paid less than the male engineers, and that's even if they were doing the same work. That meant that the women's contributions were barely acknowledged, much less celebrated. And of course, what we also have to remember is that these were the times during World War II and the Cold War. Much of the work that they were doing on a daily basis was classified, so the entire operation was, in a sense, kept out of public view. But perhaps the real reason why these figures have been hidden for so long has to do with who lives, who dies, who tells your story, to paraphrase the musical Hamilton. How do we tell stories? Yeah, I love Hamilton too. How do we tell stories? I'm just getting distracted hearing the songs in my head. Sorry about that. How do we tell stories about what it means to be Black or to be female, what it means to be a scientist, and who gets to tell the American story? So 30 years ago, as my parents dropped me on the corner of McIntyre and Alderman Road, a newly minted first-year student, I was convinced that I knew exactly how my story was going to turn out. So in 4th grade, I read a book called The Westing Game, which was one of my favorite books, still one of my favorite books. And the 13-year-old protagonist of the book, named Turtle Wexler, was a stock market whiz. And I thought to myself, I want to be just like her. I am so much like her. That is the ticket, going to the stock market. So I'm 9 years old. I told my parents that I decided that I wanted to move to New York and work on Wall Street. And honestly, if I had been able to do it right there at 9 years old, I would have done it. So you can imagine my parents were completely torn between being really excited they had such a precocious daughter and wanting to conduct an exorcism. So I entered the college, and after 2 years in the college, I transferred into the comm school. And I can tell you that one of the best classes that I took during my entire 4 years was a class that I think embodies a lot of the ideas behind the engagements in the program that you guys are here for tonight. It was a comm school class. It was called G&P. It was taught by Larry Pettit and Mike Atchison. And I think the real name of the class was Financial Forecasting and Analysis. It was called G&P because the entire point of the class was to forecast the gross national product of the US economy. And I am dating myself, of course, because what today is called gross domestic product, or GDP, and the class, in fact, today is called GDP, I believe. 30 years ago, it was called the gross national product, so I am dating myself on that. But so we had to forecast the GNP of the American economy. Then we had to forecast 8 quarters of an industry, and then 8 quarters of performance of a company within that industry. So we took all of the number crunching and the analysis and the critical thinking skills and the writing and the presentation skills that we had been taught. We collected our own data. We came up with our own assumptions. We drew our own conclusions. We presented it to the teachers and the class, and then we stood in front of a firing line of questions from the audience. And notably, what we had to do is we had to do that as a group. So that is right. Your grade and your fate was totally bound up in your ability to work with classmates who might not think the same way as you, who you might not get along with, you might not like each other, and who were all very, very opinionated. And I can say that I'm pointing my finger at myself, first of all. So I've used what I learned in that class absolutely every single day of my career, not just on Wall Street, where I did end up after graduation, but also as an entrepreneur and even in researching and writing this book. So I just want to say, first of all, to Mr. Pettit and Mr. Atchison, thank you very, very much. Now, what I have to admit to you today is that in my 4 years here, I never took a history course. The fact is that growing up here in Virginia in the 1970s and 1980s, I could never see a way to see my story in American history. So I remember elementary and junior high school and dreading those days when the social studies curriculum turned its eyes to Black history. There was slavery, there was Martin Luther King Jr., and that was it. So Black history in the classroom was always a discussion of racial violence and disenfranchisement and shame and the idea that simply by virtue of the color of their skin, my forebears were considered socially, economically, legally less than a full citizen and less than fully human. The textbooks offered cursory information about the state of blacks in America, but virtually nothing about black Americans as individuals who, as I knew firsthand, were as engaged in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness as any other citizen of our country. So I asked myself, where are the stories of the protagonists? I grew up in a world where robust families and members of a dynamic community dreamed of a better future, and they found ways, great and small, to fight against injustice. They did all they could to help people do their best work, whether that work was cleaning other people's houses, as my grandmother did, or calculating orbital trajectories, as did the women that I write about in Hidden Figures. Where in the textbooks were, for example, the business people who pooled their resources to provide mortgages to black homeowners, or the professors like my mother who taught English at Hampton University, or the scientists like my father who spent his entire career at NASA Langley. Well, there was the chemist George Washington Carver. So he was the only black scientist that people heard about during class, and they had that poor guy working overtime all during Black History Month. In general, however, I could never square the textbook's narrow and degraded presentation of the past with my present, and I certainly had problems attaching the past to my future. I was, like I'm sure many of us are, have been, an ambitious handful of a whippersnapper, and I was ready to take on the world. So as far as I was concerned, history was ballast. It was just something that was meant to be offloaded if I were going to be able to rise and pursue my version of the American dream. So it's no surprise that when I graduated, I chose investment banking, which is a career that I thought, it felt like to me, the perfect opposite of history. But as hard as I tried, I couldn't outrun the history or my own story. So after decades of living and working outside of Virginia, and in fact, working and living outside of the United States, I came back to Charlottesville last July 2016, moving back to the country. I'd been living in Mexico country, not New Mexico, as many people always think. It's Mexico country I was living in for 11 years. And here I am in Charlottesville. So today, not only am I working as a writer whose subject is history, I'm living history here in Charlottesville in a way that is terrifying and fascinating and that I never thought would occur in my lifetime. I spent 4 years of my life here at the school that was targeted by the white supremacists and Nazis in the rally. I lived 20 minutes walk from the downtown mall where the terrorist attack happened, and half an hour from the Confederate statues that ignited this firestorm. So, there's been a lot of talk around town and the country about how what happened here, it doesn't represent Charlottesville or America as we currently believe it to be. And I love my country. I love the United States of America. I love my native state, and I love this city. I am a very proud graduate of the University of Virginia. But I also know the history, and what happened on August 12th, that too is a part of us. It is a part of us that has battled the better angels of our nature since the beginning of our country. From the 1930s, from the 1950s, for example, this school and other Virginia universities paid qualified black students of the Hidden Figures generation to attend graduate school out of state rather than allow them to continue their educations here in Virginia. The push to segregate public schools in the United States is the secondary narrative of my book, Hidden Figures. The Commonwealth of Virginia closed its schools, including the public schools here in Charlottesville, rather than allow blacks to learn alongside whites, and that was nearly a century after the end of the Civil War. So I believe one of the reasons why the push to remove these statues is so strong right now is because the statues symbolize not just the presence of that racial apartheid that marks our history, but it also symbolizes an absence. The absence of tales of people who lived not just black lives, but American lives, like the residents of the Black Vinegar Hill neighborhood here in Charlottesville where the statues were built. It's the absence of fully realized people who pushed our country to live up to its founding ideals, not despite their history, but because of it. That absence has created a powerful vacuum, and that vacuum is trying urgently to absorb the stories of people like Dorothy Vaughan and like Mary Jackson, like Katherine Johnson and Christine Darden. So Hidden Figures is a Black story. It is a Virginian story. It's a women's story. It's a mathematician's story. But because of all of these things, it is most fundamentally an American story. Now, what I'd like to do is to take a moment to answer another question that I know from experience that many of you are asking. And this question was expressed most eloquently to me by a little boy who came to a book reading that I did early this year, and he asked me, if the figures were hidden, how did you find them? One of the most brilliant questions anyone has ever asked. Very deep philosophical question. And the fact is, the figures, they found me. So my father, he is a retired NASA Langley atmospheric scientist, and he worked with Mary Jackson and Katherine Johnson and Christine Darden. My mother is a retired English professor at Hampton University. This is the school that trained Langley's first Black female mathematicians. My husband, Aaron Shetterly, he is also a writer, and he has an unerring instinct for a good story. And he has the distinction of being the first person to ask that question, why haven't I heard this story before? That was the beginning of the journey of Hidden Figures. And what happened is that he saw something that the rest of us from Hampton, Virginia, simply were too close to see. So growing up there, I had the very good fortune to see Black or female mathematicians, scientists, engineers as totally normal people. They were as normal as the white male mathematicians and scientists and engineers. They were as normal as the teachers and the bus drivers and the lawyers and the construction workers and the military people who lived in our community. So there was no cognitive dissonance for me when I heard the words Black and female and scientist, and I realized that that was referring to just one person, not three distinct people. But even though I knew these women, I knew them, I remember Katherine Johnson as a little girl, I remember these women, I knew them, but I didn't know the history, and I certainly didn't appreciate the significance of what happened in my hometown. So in 2010, I conducted the first interview with Katherine Johnson in her house, and that's where I first heard the name Dorothy Vaughan. So Katherine Johnson said to me, sitting on her couch, Dorothy Vaughan is the smartest person I ever met. And if Katherine Johnson is saying that about somebody, well, you better take out your pencil and start writing really quickly. So I started searching for Dorothy's name in the Norfolk Journal and Guide, which is the Black newspaper in Virginia. And eventually I stumbled upon a tiny news item, Dateline, Farmville, Virginia, December 3rd, 1943. Mrs. D.J. Vaughan, math teacher at the high school, has accepted a position at Langley Field. And when I saw that, and it still gives me chills, I knew that is when I found the beginning of my book. So the Black newspapers, they've been telling stories about America's Black community since the beginning, and if it weren't for them, I wouldn't be standing here talking about these women. When people ask me, well, how did you know what Mary Jackson was wearing at her wedding day, which is one of the descriptions in the book, I'm like, well, I saw the picture in the Norfolk Journal and Guide. It's absolutely amazing what that newspaper archived and what it gave to me for my research. And in fact, my next book, which I've just started working on, is largely about one of the Black newspapers. But the Black newspapers were far from the only place that I had to look to put this story together. So for 6 years, I interviewed family members. I raided the NASA History Office in DC. I used the National Archives in Maryland and Philadelphia and Chicago and Texas. I submitted FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. I spent more time than I can count looking at photos, at telephone books, at memos, at films of wind tunnel tests. And much of that information that I used from NASA was saved and digitized by somebody that I consider a history superhero, a woman named Mary Gaynor Hurst. She just retired last year, and she was in the NASA Langley Center's history group. She is an absolutely stupendous public historian, and she did so much to help me find the raw material of this book. So then I also had to read lots of textbooks on aeronautics and engineering so I could understand exactly what these women were doing and write about it. So all those years of calculus and physics that my dad forced me to take, sitting at the kitchen table as a high school student, tears be damned, it really came in handy for writing this book. So I followed the trail absolutely anywhere I could find evidence of these women. I loved the research process, and if it weren't for the fact that I had to actually deliver a book, I would probably still be researching. And I still have a habit of looking through eBay and browsing for vintage aeronautics textbooks and slide rules. But what I learned over the course of this research is that immersing yourself in the facts and the circumstances of someone else's life has a magical and transformative quality. Over time, you find that the years of that person and the signs of old age, they start to fade away. Their voices grow stronger, and the person who in the present moment might be an older person reflecting on a long life, they start to move back in time. And so eventually I was able to see these women as they were at all of their different stages of life. A smooth-skinned young woman with eyes bright like diamonds, head full of dreams and ambition, with so many roads for them still to choose, like so many of you here. Or as a woman who, despite the advance of middle age, still harbors ambitions and is willing to work as hard as she ever has to make her dreams come true, like me. And as I researched these women, I returned them to youth, and I even returned those who were no longer alive to life. I could hear their voices, and I really felt like the book wasn't so much coming from my imagination as that I was, listening to these women tell their stories, and that I was simply transcribing. So this is my first book, and I am very aware of just how lucky I am to have found a publisher. And then having that book made into a movie, that is more than I ever imagined possible when I started this journey back in 2010. So I'm going to read your minds once again. You are asking, how is it that the Hidden Figures book was published in September of last year and the movie was in theaters by Christmas Eve? So that is its own story, which I will tell you. In March 2014, my literary agent, who's a very talented young woman named Mackenzie Brady Watson, she sold my book proposal to HarperCollins. And then a couple of weeks later, I got a call from someone named Donna Gelati, who is a film producer, and she had gotten a hold of this proposal through this mysterious network of book scouts, which are people whose job it is to find literary properties that might make good films. So Donna calls me up, and I remember vividly, I was at Hampton at the time doing interviews, and I think I was just coming back from seeing Katherine Johnson, and I pulled over into the parking lot of the Food Lion to take the call. So she tells me, we are going to make a movie of your book. And, you know, it's just like in the movies. So I'm like, okay, you realize that I am still writing this book. And who are you? Like, who is this on the phone? And so it turns out that this Donna Gelati, she just happens to be the Academy Award-winning producer of Shakespeare in Love. She's the producer of Silver Linings Playbook, and she is one of a very small cadre of women in Hollywood who are powerful enough to greenlight a film. So I sold her the option to my book, and at the time, I didn't know if that was the best thing or the worst thing that had ever happened to me, because there I was, a first-time author. I was learning how to write a book, and I was trying to finish that book ahead of this freight train of a movie production, which Donna is pushing along at record speed. And while it would have been one thing if I were agreeing to a portrayal of my own life story, I made the decision to entrust the life stories of other people to these Hollywood folks that I had only just met. And these are people who know my parents, they're people I run into in the Food Lion in Hampton, and if the movie turned out to be a disaster, they would know exactly where to find me. So Donna, she hired me as a consultant. I also got an executive producer credit, excuse me, and this was a crash course in what it takes to turn a literary property into a film. But really wonderfully, they went out of their way to solicit my input, And they kept me very involved, but I was naturally anxious because my name was going to be on this film. But at the end of the day, I had no authority over the final cut. So while the script was being written, every once in a while I would get a draft. I'd read it, and I'd get Donna on the phone, and I would just freak out about some of the plot points in this. And I'd be like, Donna, how can you show Dorothy Vaughan driving these women to work? Dorothy Vaughan never learned to drive in real life. I'd be like, Donna, how can you show Katherine Johnson running to the bathroom? In real life, it was Mary Jackson who ran to the bathroom. And I'd say, and I'm sorry, you guys are going to see the movie tonight, so anyway, let's just say a lot of the things in the movie, I was just like, this is not true in the book. How can you take this book that I have researched meticulously, and I have a trailer in the back of my parents' house full of documents, and you are turning it around and twisting it, and I don't understand. It was a very difficult process. So I saw a really early rough cut of the final film a year ago, one that didn't have music yet, and I thought, well, you know what? It's okay. It's fine. It's great. I'm sure, it's great. This movie, it's okay. Whatever. Sort of very. And then I found out that the producers scheduled the first public showing of the final cut of the movie on December 1st in Hampton, the hometown crowd. So this is Katherine Johnson, star of the movie, and her family, the families of Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson. NASA mathematicians, the engineers who worked there and worked with these women, the administrator of NASA, all the NASA muckety-mucks, and my parents. And on top of that, I was not able to make it. So needless to say, that night, I barely slept. And so the next morning, first thing, I called my mother, and I was like, okay, what did you guys think about the movie? And she starts raving. She's like, what about Dorothy? I'm like, Dorothy and the driving and Mary and Katherine and, the sign and, all this stuff. And, and my mom's like, no, it was great. We loved it. Katherine Johnson and her family, they loved it. Everyone, they loved it. They were laughing and they were talking at the screen. They were crying. And then at the end, they show the real women's photos on the screen. And my mom's like, and we all started screaming and clapping and jumping up and down and going crazy. My mom is saying this. And I'm like, wow, okay, this is very interesting. And the thing that was amazing is that the narrative dream of the film and the authenticity of the film was so complete that my mother asked me if they filmed the movie in Katherine Johnson's house, and she has been in Katherine Johnson's house. So I finally saw the final version of a screening in New York about 2 weeks after that, and ironically, it was on the same day that they announced that John Glenn had died, so it was very emotional. Very, very emotional. And what I learned seeing the movie and having gone through that whole process is that there's no way to transform a book into a movie, a good movie, I think, without creating composite characters and conflating timelines and taking some dramatic license. But the thing is, from the opening scene to the end credits, I watched that movie as if I had never heard of Katherine Johnson and Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson. And I was sitting on the edge of my seat. Is Katherine going to finish the calculations? What is going to happen with John Glenn's flight? Is he going to make it home to Earth safely? I mean, this is in 2016. We know the answer to these questions. But the fact is, I loved it as much as everyone else, and I was completely captivated by the storytelling. And since then, I don't even want to tell you how many times I've seen the movie. I saw it with the cast and the Hollywood people at the premieres, and I saw it with a group of MIT engineering students. I've seen it with a theater full of black women from Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority in Hampton, Virginia, which is the sorority that the women, Katherine and the other women in the book, and actually my mom are members of. I've seen it with the NASA people. I saw it on Capitol Hill with Virginia Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner and our congressman from Hampton Roads, Bobby Scott. My husband, Aaron, and I went to go see it here at the Violet Crown just before it left the theater, and I have seen it with moviegoers of every conceivable age, gender, race, ethnicity, class, professional background, and yes, political persuasion. And when the movie came out, Ted Cruz and Mike Huckabee tweeted about how they thought it was a wonderful American movie, and I think that is fantastic. And this is, this was something that I think a lot of people saw the same way at the same time with the same perspective, and it really made me feel very proud to have worked on this project. But what's funny is every single time I've seen the movie, I have loved it more. I've seen all of the historical documents. They were all in the trailer behind my parents' house. I've talked to the real women. I know it's fact and I know it's fictionalized, and I have been taken aback as to how much I needed this story too. Not just the history, but the story, because stories matter. And stories matter here in the United States of America. Really, America may be the only country in the world that is founded by a bunch of writers. Really, when you think about it, Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, Franklin, their prose expressing lucid ideas about the nature of humanity and the nature of freedom is some of the most admired and influential writing in the history of the world. America is essentially a work of the imagination, so it's no surprise that we, its citizens, devote so much of our lives pursuing an American dream and to telling an American story. And by writing Hidden Figures, I got to tell my American story, the beautiful parts and all of the painful parts, all of it together. My father's name is Robert B. Lee, and his family roots are in Westmoreland County, Virginia, which also happens to be the birthplace of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And like immigrants from foreign shores, my parents and their grandparents, they fought their way from the land of segregation so that they would be able to put me and my siblings in a place where we might be able to get a grip on those fabled blessings of democracy. Standing on the shoulders of a multitude of hidden figures, my father became a NASA scientist, and my mother became an English professor. I'm a black woman married to a white man living in the home of the 1967 Supreme Court case that overturned the sanction against interracial marriage. So the person that you see standing before you here today is the sum total of all of that history. The racial and segregation associated with the Confederate monuments are part of our story, as are the revolutionary ideals of progress and of freedom that were written into our founding documents. And America is about so very much more. It's about the lives and the beliefs and the stories of every single person in this country, no matter where they came from or when or how they got here. As James Baldwin said, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. So in the time since my classroom days, I've stopped viewing history as a forced encounter with the pain of the past. Rather, I see it as the sum total of what each of us does every day. Knowledge of history is a prerequisite for being an informed and responsible citizen, and it's the precursor of progress and social change. And what I understand now that I didn't understand 30 years ago when I was sitting in your position is that storytelling, which is the essence of history, determines both the meaning of our past and the trajectory of our future. And nobody knew that better than our founding writers. They wrote our country into existence. And for the rest of us, whether our stories here began with the Bill of Rights or with the Bill of Sale, it is our responsibility to be the protagonists of our own stories and to write our lives into the great epic of America. Thank you.
What a wonderful inaugural event for the Engagements Lecture Series. I'm Sarah Betzer, and with Chad Wellman, I'm the co-chair of the Engagements, courses that comprise an important piece of the new college curriculum, a new general education pilot that launched this fall in the College of Arts and Sciences at UVA. It is wonderful to see so many of our students, right about 600, if the count's right, in the audience tonight, along with so many members of the community. It's wonderful to be together on this occasion. We're pleased and grateful to recognize the support that made tonight possible. First of all, from the College of Arts and Sciences, but also from the UVA Engineering School in their Excellence Through Diversity Distinguished Learning Series. And that series is truly extraordinary, and there are a number of speakers that might be interesting to this audience, among them Michelle Alexander in February, Angela Davis in March. You can learn about the entire series on the website for the UVA School of Engineering. Future engagements lecture series speakers include Mark Dion, New York-based artist, on October 23rd. And on February 1st, back here at the Paramount, Danielle Allen, most recently author of Cuz, director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, a political theorist who's published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. The engagement series this year is focused on the subject and the concept of the university. And so when the college fellows faculty, the faculty designing and launching these new courses came together to dream up this series, we immediately thought of Margot Lee Shetterly as an exceptionally wonderful option or choice were we to be so lucky as a leading voice in so many, a whole suite of issues germane to our thinking about higher education these days, as you've just heard. So we're about to go into the Q&A, the long-awaited, I know, for our students' Q&A, but before we do so, just a couple of announcements, I guess 3. The buses, you know this already, students, but I've been asked to say it again out loud, the buses end at 11:30. There's a Cinderella thing happening. It's a little before midnight. 11:30, but don't wait, is the message. There's a book signing after the Q&A in the lobby. And at 8:30, there'll be a screening of Hidden Figures. Okay, so we'll be passing the mic back to Margot Lee Shetterly and back to Professor Lisa Woolfolk, who will MC the Q&A. Lisa Woolfolk is a professor in the Department of English, a beloved teacher, and is among the very first cohort of engagements professors. So we'll welcome back to the stage Margot Lee Shetterly and Professor Lisa Woolfolk.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And it was a beautiful presentation, and you all are about to see a fantastic film. She gave you a few spoilers, but you know, we can live with that. We know it's about the journey and not the destination. So I'm here to help facilitate the answering of questions for you. So I'm happy to turn it over to the audience. Are there any questions? I have, of course, a notebook full of questions, but it's not my turn. So I'm happy to see what other folks might want to say. And there's microphones down there as well. So I see a hand here. There's a hand right here.
Hello, my name is EJ Davis. My question comes from my engagement discussion section, where we raised a question of having attended the University of Virginia, and in your book, Mary Jackson attempted to go to the University of Virginia, but was denied on grounds of race and gender. So having attended, how do you feel having gone to this school? And what advice would you give to students who now go to this school, both of color and of not?
So start with an easy one. I like that.
Right? Well, I learned so much doing the research for this book. So, for example, I went to public schools, elementary schools in the state of in Hampton, Virginia, in the 70s, and then continued in the 80s. And what I really didn't understand was how close my attendance in public school was to the end of segregation, because even though 1954 was the Brown versus Board of Education decision, Virginia closed the schools. Like it took a long time, another lawsuit, a lot of effort in order for that to actually happen. And I was not aware of that. I went to integrated schools. I had an extremely positive experience in those public schools. Integrated white friends. There was a large Vietnamese community because it's a defense industry. You know, a lot of people from everywhere, essentially, who came to that school. And that was my upbringing. It was extremely positive. Economically integrated, which is something that I think that happens less and less these days. And so I really didn't know that history, and I didn't know anything about the history of the graduate students who had been paid to go out of state until I started doing this research. So, you know, it was very complicated. You know, having that understanding and that conflict, that duality, is complicated. But, you know, history is complicated. The history of this country is very complicated. I think it's better, I find for myself, I would prefer to really understand the history and then to be able to have a conversation with people about it and to have the feelings about it and to talk to people, you know, who lived through it on all sides, really. I mean, in terms of understanding that past. You know, I've talked to people who were, you know, who did not feel that the segregation was something that should happen at that time. You know, I really want to understand that. Hopefully understanding that will allow me, I think, to integrate those different parts of myself. You know, I mean, I'm an American, I'm a black woman, you know, I am a graduate of the University of Virginia, I'm a Southerner. You know, there are a lot of conflicts, potential conflicts among those things. I would like to just look at the history square and incorporate those things into who I am and figure out how I take that knowledge of history to uphold what I believe are very beautiful ideals, which are liberty and justice for all, and those founding documents. You know, I am passionate about those things, and I feel like the best way for me to figure out how to do my part in bringing that society about is to look at that hard history very squarely.
I think that's really fantastic. And it's a quick follow-up. Yes, let's clap. Something I was thinking of when you mentioned history, it took me all the way back to 1892. And there's a black woman historian, Anna Julia Cooper, who has this book, A Voice from the South. And she says, only the black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood without violence, without suing or special patronage. Then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me. And when you've done what you've done in the story so powerfully is to, as you said, that for you growing up, normal was black, female, scientist, and have them not be three different people. That one person, your Sunday school teacher, for example, or your mother's sorority sister, these were women that did this all the time, and this was normal for you. And I just find that that is such an important new default setting. And it allows us to think about the larger picture of America as something that is not limited to very small segments of the population. That when you think scientist, of course you could think black woman Sunday school teacher. You know, I mean, I thought that was one of the things that I really valued so much about your book, about this way to think differently, about how we do higher education, how we do learning. I was so stunned by that. I didn't know that the state of Virginia would pay promising black students to go to college other than places at the University of Virginia. Like, what a waste of resources, a brain drain, a waste of money. And now here we are at this wonderful place, this wonderful time in our history where we get a chance to look back at that history squarely and figure out where we've been and what we want to do differently. So.
And I think the thing that that I also learned during this history, and I think it's also important, is that everyone was impacted by this. This was something that there were a lot of white students who were also out of school, and you know, there's an engineer, one of the engineers that I interviewed. I interviewed many of these engineers for this book. Who grew up in Westmoreland County, where my dad's family's from, and from a very poor family who made money digging potatoes, essentially, until he was...
This is a white man.
This is a white man who's, I guess he's 93 or 94 now. Wonderful, wonderful guy who did some really fascinating work during the space program. Anyway, and so he said that he remembered as a kid, very poor family, that he would get picked up from school in a rickety old broken down bus, and he would see the black kids getting picked up from school in a rickety old broken down bus. And he was just like, well, this is ridiculous. Like, if we all went to school in the same bus, like, maybe they wouldn't have to be rickety and broken down.
We could afford one good bus.
We could afford one good bus instead of having these two rickety old broken down buses. And so, I think this is something that we the entire society suffers when we make these decisions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Other questions? I have one right here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lelia Battle, and I'm wondering, how do you feel that your book has impacted society's outlook on women in science and in the general workplace?
I hope the book has helped to dispel the myth that women are not good in math and science.
Yes.
And it's a zeitgeisty kind of thing because Hidden Figures came out, The Glass Universe came out, which is an excellent book. I learned so much about astronomy that I didn't know about. It's a great book. Natalia Holt's book came out about the women working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and so much of the advances, the technological advances of the 20th century happened thanks to women sitting in rooms doing math. Somebody had to do the numbers. You've got to do the numbers when you, whether it's understanding and cataloging the stars or, the aeronautical work, fundamental research that they were doing at NASA. And so I hope that this shines a light on that work that those women were doing, that they were there because they were very good at their jobs, and that their work contributed directly to the fact that, for example, you get on a plane and it is safe, it is efficient, it flies well in inclement weather. All of these are the things that these women were working on before the space program. So I hope that it really shows that women are good at math, and that women, and particularly black women, are passionate for their jobs. Like, these are people who were as interested in this work as any of the men that they worked with. They loved this work. They had multiple identities, and one of them was like geek scientist mathematician, and that was great.
That's excellent. Great question. Thank you. Oh, yes, that's fine.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm here really by happenstance, and I don't really believe in happenstance. I think everything happens for a reason. I'm in Charlottesville today because I came down here looking for a piano.
I saw one backstage. They've got one.
I'm the musician at my church, and I was looking for a piano. So I was here shopping, and my friend and I came, and we happened to come down on the mall, and we looked at the covered-up statues, and I took a few pictures, and we came down here, and I saw that you were speaking. I said, can we go? Can we go? Can we stay? I'm just absolutely overjoyed. But I have the question I have for you goes to the movie, and how many people have seen the movie? I don't want to ruin it. Okay. But if I could ask a question, you talked about, of course, that this is a true story based on true lives, and there's some fictionalization in the movie. Would you talk about the Kevin Costner role? How that came about, and how you feel about his role?
Right.
Thank you.
So, I guess are we going to have the spoiler alert? I don't know if enough people have seen the movie.
Oh, wow. Out, nice. There's a person in the front row is like, if you don't want spoilers, get out. That was her right there. That wasn't me. I didn't say it. I was quoting someone else. They just gave me a microphone.
I will discuss it in a way that doesn't totally spoil the movie. So, I think the point about the Kevin Costner character, he plays a role in the end of the segregation at the NASA center, and this, there were quite a few fictionalizations in the movie, and this was one of the ongoing conversations that I had with the producer and the screenwriter and the director, and there were times when, there were things, and I was like, you know what, if you put this in, I will never be able to go home to Hampton, Virginia again. You must take this out. There was a real push and pull, and so the Kevin Costner character is a fictional character. So he's sort of like the head of NASA, and like everyone's kind of reporting to him in a way, or like the head of engineering or something, when in fact NASA is this super bureaucratic, like cubicle, of an organization. And his, this character is sort of loosely based on 3 people, kind of, in real life. But I think he was really meant in the movie to kind of represent the kind of the institutional soul of NASA, if you will, and to represent really the blind spots of NASA. So one of the things that I thought was really important to me in the book and also in the movie was that this not be like the Klan comes to NASA or something. Like this could not be about, I think a lot of times when you think about the segregation and these things, it's like these very hard, violent, these kinds of things. And what I really wanted was for the movie to show how this occupies sort of mental space for these women and decisions all the time. That it's like, the coffee pot.
That's the thing.
Absolutely. If I touch the coffee pot, then people are going to get a new coffee pot, and that kind of thing. And
the subtle forms, that it's not the KKK riding through. It's about how white supremacy shapes the way people think and act
and the blind
behave.
spots that
And
Kevin
accidentally.
Costner, as a character, never saw these things. The coffee pot was there and the bathroom is there, and he didn't know that Catherine was, going through these things until his job and his output and his productivity is affected. And so the thing that I also really thought was great about the Kevin Costner character, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about him being the white savior and, the white guy who comes in and, just in one fell swoop kind of gets rid of the segregation. I think for those of us who have worked in particularly a corporate environment and a bureaucracy and a hierarchy, if you have someone who is willing to go to the mat to make it possible for you to do your job, just liberate you to do your job, that is fantastic.
Yes.
And this character was willing to basically put himself on the line to make sure that those women could do what they were really good at, which was be a mathematician. That is what you dream of if you are in an environment like that, especially working in some place like Wall Street, like I did, which is a lot like, in terms of very assertive environment, like NASA. And the other thing that I thought was really great is that in popular film and books, often the black character's role is to kind of save the soul of America and make everybody do the right thing. And you know what? In this time, it was Kevin Costner's job to save the soul of America, and these women got to save the space program. And I thought that was really great.
Nice. That's a nice switch. That's a nice switch. Absolutely. Right here on the front, and I see someone in the upper right as well. I'm so sorry. It's a little hard for me to see because of the lights, so I'm not ignoring you or pretending that I don't see you. I probably really don't see you. Yes.
Okay, hi. My name is Grace O. Jemphy, and my question. Okay, I have 2 questions. Number 1, did you see Hamilton? And number two, your book, when I remember when Hidden Figures came out, and I just like sat there and was like, whoa, I never like knew this, and I haven't watched the movie yet, so everything's a spoiler. But and another
It's
thing,
still really great. There'll be a lot of great surprises.
and another thing is just like so many things happen in Virginia that we never know about. Like I remember finding out in the 8th grade about the Loving case and how until like 1969 interracial marriage was still illegal in Virginia, and how literally 5 strong black women changed the face of science, and we never learned that in science class, never learned it in history. We always learn about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr.'s, Madam C.J. Walker, if we're lucky, W.E.B. Du Bois, and so on and so forth. So my question to you is, do you think that by writing this book and having it be a movie, did you change Virginia history? And like, will you change like how history is taught in our schools so people know about these things and about our heroes that we never learn about?
So first of all, yes, I have seen Hamilton.
Awesome.
That was very exciting. And in fact, when I was finishing the book, before I got a chance to see it, I listened to Hamilton on repeat, absolute repeat. I have listened to it more times than you have listened to it.
I don't think you've listened to it more times than I've listened to it.
I've listened to it more times than you have listened to it.
I don't know. I haven't seen the play, so I have like intense longing. So I don't know. I'm listening to it right now in my head.
I'm listening to it right now in my head too. So here's the thing. As I said, I did not take a history class while I was here, but I really love reading about history. I love narrative nonfiction, and I love like Lawrence of Arabia and Julius Caesar and the sweeping big epics. I love it. And what I wanted for Hidden Figures was that. I wanted the epic. Like I wanted these women who looked like me to star in that huge epic kind of a literature. But at the same time, I love the stories about people who aren't the kings or the presidents and who lived really interesting lives and whose lives intersected those great sweeps, but perhaps weren't the people in the limelight. And so I hope that maybe what Hidden Figures, that maybe what it might do is to encourage people to look beyond the narrow scope of history and to be curious and to ask questions of your families or look in those old family documents or spend times in library archives and see all this dusty stuff and just get curious. Like all of that stuff is really fascinating to me. And I think the thing that has been interesting that sort of shows that people are curious in the untold history, let's call it, the stuff that you have to really look in the corners to know about, is the fact that this term Hidden Figures now has come to mean or to stand in for people who have done something that is important or notable, but for some reason have not been talked about before. Like it's sort of like having 3D glasses or something, that people want these 3D glasses that can see the hidden figures. So you're looking through the regular glasses and reading the history textbook, and you're reading the regular stuff, I guess. But if you put on the special Hidden Figures glasses, then you see all of this, this history that is hiding in the shadows, that is as interesting or more interesting than what you've learned all the time in the history books. And I think that is great. And then, you really do turn up connections between those big picture things that you have, that you've always learned about. So I don't know, I think really, for me, writing Hidden Figures, I was just like, I need to know what happened. Like, I just need to know how this story turns out. I need to know, or I knew how it turned out. Like, I'm kind of how it turned out. But I needed to know how it started, which was, how did those women get to NASA? Why were they hiring black women at NASA Langley in the 1940s? It was just, I just had to know the story. So I think that curiosity about the people around us and about those smaller but very important connections to history. That's the way we'll find out more stories like this.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Clap, clap. Because as you were talking, I like to take a lot of notes, and so you didn't answer the question, did you change Virginia history? I'll answer it and say, yes, I think she did. I think this book totally changes Virginia history. So thank you very much for that. And I think that it also gives us a great illustration about following your curiosity, that intellectual curiosity, and also the power of local history. That these were women that you knew, these are women that you could read about in the local newspaper, these were people who were in your life, but also had stories that you didn't know. And it turns out that their story is America's story. And it really does help to shape in very powerful ways how we define and think about America, how we define and think about science and progress. And so I think it's an incredibly powerful and useful gift, not just as a document, but also as a process. The process that you underwent. And so to think about that for the engagement curriculum overall, one of the great advantages I think of this curriculum is the way that it helps to connect the 4 different engagements to each other and to establish a great foundation for an undergraduate education that we could then launch forward to follow a variety of curiosities. So that's a great model for that. Thank you. Another question? Wait, I see someone. Hi.
Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, was I supposed to go this way? Can I get you next, and then we'll go back and forth so that your turn to go this way? Okay, so I have to go this side, but I promise I'll come back to you.
Right. Sounds good.
Keep the microphone. Not forever, but just until the next question.
Okay. Good evening. My name
evening.
is Miriam Sayed, and my engagement discussion class came up with a question to ask you. But before that, I just wanted to say that both the book and the movie were amazing, and I have such an appreciation for the fact that you took the initiative and time to trace back the lives of these women in order to educate us all about the importance and the significance of the hard work they dedicated their lives to. So thank you so much for that. And our question is, given the fact that African Americans were discriminated against in the U.S. during the Cold War, why do you think African American women such as Catherine, Dorothy, and Mary chose to serve the United States in the space race?
There were a lot of reasons. So first of all, these were very good jobs. And when these women first started working in these jobs during World War II, most of them were teachers. And they, just by virtue of accepting the job at NASA, they started getting paid 2.5 to 3 times more than they were making as a teacher. So there was a very immediate economic incentive for doing this job. Second, as I mentioned, they were doing the job that they had been trained to do. So these were women who loved math, were very good at math, and they were going to be mathematicians at one of the highest level research facilities in the world. So, that was also something that you would never turn down. But the other thing is there was this issue of fighting, of patriotism as a way of pushing America to living up to its ideals. So in World War II, the black newspapers had a campaign called the Double V, the Double Victory, and that was, they basically pushed African Americans to join the war effort, full throttle war effort, with the idea that that effort would help to vanquish America's enemies abroad and vanquish the enemies within the country, which were the people perpetuating prejudice and racism. And so they were fighting for 2 things. They were really fighting for full entry into American society, full citizenship rights, and at the same time fighting as Americans for the ideals of the country. So, and it's not to say that those things were without conflict. There's certainly internal conflict, and there was community conflict about what should be done. Should we join the war effort? Will this advance our goals? Is it right as an African American to, in the case of the Cold War particularly, they felt like, well, there are people who look like me abroad, and why would I want to join the country's fight against people like in Vietnam, people who perhaps are I see as more closely allied to me than people here in this country. I mean, there are any number of conflicts about that. But these women, I spent a lot of time interviewing them, and they really felt very strongly allied with the United States and with its goals, with NASA, and with their responsibility as a government scientist.
And I think that I love the metaphor you described earlier about the glasses, putting on the special glasses. It's like these women, in their patriotism, were able to see America for all that it could be rather than what it really was. That they weren't limited by that very heavy and weighty and deliberate racism and oppression that they were facing every day, that they were willing to stand in the gap between the promises of America and the practices of America. And I think that that's another kind of very powerful story about their patriotism and about how their resolve and their choice to do this, despite knowing that they had to be in a special room just for the colored computers, or that they were limited in facilities, and the pay was different, all of that. And they still, for their own integrity, not because they believed or committed to this racist system, but because of their own integrity. I just thought that was just very powerfully done.
I have to say, there's so many things that I learned, that I read, that I'm still reading, that I want to read. And the United States Constitution, so, the secondary narrative of the push to desegregate America's schools, which really, it culminated in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but it really started in the 1930s, and with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Charles Hamilton Houston, and Katherine Johnson, for example. Katherine Johnson was one of the 3 black students to integrate West Virginia's graduate schools because of a case that an NAACP case that had gone to the Supreme Court, and instead of fight it, West Virginia decided to comply. And so I learned a lot about the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which essentially the NAACP said, we are going to force you in court to live up to these American ideals. And so I started, it's like, okay, well, I need to go back and I need to read the Constitution, which I think we should all do that. It's sort of like every day when you're on a website and the website says, okay, do you accept these terms of service and privacy conditions? And we just check yes, and we never read it. And I think that, our founding documents are like that. We consent to these documents. We should read them and understand what's in them and how they apply to our daily lives. And so that's something that I'm doing, that sort of has come out of a consequence of doing this research, which I think is really wonderful, and I think I should have done it 30 years ago.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for waiting. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Hi, my name is Jasmine Mao, and my engagements discussion class would like to know, in regards to racism and prejudice, how have your own experiences influenced the portrayal of the characters in the story?
That is a really good question. So I graduated in 1991. My first job was on Wall Street. I worked at JP Morgan as a foreign exchange trader. Then I went to Merrill Lynch and I worked in the fixed income capital markets group. And then sort of spent time working in the internet industry, even in the early days of that, and as an entrepreneur. So I've had this really wide-ranging career, but a lot of my career was spent where I was the only woman, or one of few women, or the only African American, or one of very few. And I think because of that, because of having been in a room, these very hard-charging rooms, like these editorial meetings that Katherine Johnson fights her way into, and certainly not coming close to the times that they lived in, but knowing what it's like to have that twinge of, being in the room and being the only whatever, but at the same time, being really ambitious and being really competitive and being really eager to say, I don't care who you are, like we're all going to be in this forum here and we're going to, duke it out, whatever the idea is. I'm ready the same way the rest of you guys are. I knew what that was like. I knew what that felt like, so I knew what it felt like to be the person outside of the room and wanting to be inside the room, like Katherine Johnson, and talking to her about that, and not just understanding that, but feeling that, and feeling the ambition of Dorothy Vaughan, of wanting to be the supervisor of all of the women, not just the black women. She wanted to move up and not be limited in any way. So I understood that, and because I understood that, it really was very touching, I guess, it was a really emotional experience to have had my experiences and then to listen to those women 50 years before and, talking about what it was like then, and to have such an appreciation of the guts that it takes, it's like you're in a room with a bunch of people and you want to ask a question. These things, to raise your hand and to speak up, those things take a lot of energy and they take guts. And they did that in a time when it wasn't even legally possible for them to go to the same bathroom as their white colleagues. And so I really had a tremendous respect for the everyday courage that those women have, and their relentlessness, that they were just like, what? I don't care. I am going to keep moving forward. They can throw the coffee pot into the trash or whatever, but my goal here is to prove that I am absolutely the best person for this job, and then to unite with my colleagues so that we can get this job done. So, I did identify a lot with those women for the situations and also for the ambition that they had.
Great. That's great. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Fiona Morgan. I go to Charlottesville High School.
Oh, my son goes to Charlottesville High School. Should I not say that?
What's his name?
He's here, so we'll have to talk about it later.
Okay, cool. Okay.
I don't want to embarrass him.
It's okay.
So maybe when you're
I
done, just come
understand.
over here.
Yeah.
Okay. What grade are you in?
I'm a junior.
Okay, he's in 9th grade, but I'm not going to look over where he is.
Okay.
Because I don't want to embarrass him.
It's okay.
So go ahead, keep
Okay.
talking. Pretend it's just us.
So I'm in a class called BGC. It stands for Becoming a Global Citizen, and we're doing a lot of it's a direct democracy classroom. So all the students decide what we're doing in the class and all the rules for the classroom, and it's taught by the ESL teacher at our school, and I love it. But we're hosting a dialogue on race, and it's a safe space forum, and we need to think of a question and an answer, something to say to everyone at my school, mostly about what happened here in Charlottesville, because there's so many people affected by it at my school specifically. And also I have another question. Do you think that, I don't know, just for me, this is the first year that I've ever had a woman of color teach me history, and it's crazy, but I was just wondering if you think that the reason that you didn't like history in high school is because of who was teaching you or what they were teaching you.
I think the reason why I didn't like history is because I thought that the finance and investment banking. It felt very powerful and very forward, and it felt like a way to be a protagonist and to, cast off all of these hard and heavy things from the past and to say, I'm going to, fly over those things into this future and be very powerful. I think it had a lot to do with that. And there's, in order to face history, you have to make yourself vulnerable. You cannot do it, regardless of who you are. You have to make yourself vulnerable. You have to face things that are very hard. You have to, I believe, listen to people whose opinions that you may not agree with. And if you really want to learn something, to be in a place with them where you allow them and you allow yourself to be honest, those things are really hard. They are very, very hard. And so I think perhaps it has as much to do with me being at a place where I am comfortable and feel very at ease having those conversations and looking at that history and feeling that I am more of myself as opposed to less of myself by doing it. So, but I don't think it had to do with who was teaching it. There were some really excellent history teachers in my high school. But I also think that, history, like science, gets a bad rap as being really boring. And it's simply not true. Science is absolutely fascinating. It is beautiful, the way music is beautiful. And history is great. I mean, it's, like somebody's going to tell you these stories and you're just like, oh my God, what happened next? History is, needs, better branding or something. I don't know.
I think you've done that.
Yeah, so I don't think it was that. I think it has to do with the fact that you have to, it makes you vulnerable. But that's also the wonderful thing about history.
That's wonderful. For this, we're going to have to draw a line here and have that be our last question. I'm getting a lot of which means they're going to either murder me or I need to stop talking. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And thank you.